Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Near the end of Section 8 of the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, David Hume has a treatment of what you can recognize as the classic problem of evil, which has to do with whether God is in some way responsible for or accountable for the badness that we encounter in our experience and in the world, and running throughout human history as well. And Hume's argument here, or his treatment, his account, ultimately doesn't tell you the conclusion that he's tending towards, which is really that classical theism is fundamentally wrong in asserting that there is a God of the sort that Christians tend to believe in, this, creator of everything, omnipotent, all good, all those sorts of attributes. Hume is not actually going to come out and say that. Instead, what he's going to do, and this is kind of a typical argumentative technique that you see, for example, in the dialogues concerning natural religion, is raise, a problem and then say, well, here's some ways of addressing this, and then say, well, these ways of addressing it, here's how they're framed, but they're not very good, are they? So therefore, something else must be the case, and that something else, in this case, would be classical theism gets taken off the dock. Because Hume wants to hold on to this, what he calls doctrine of necessity. And it makes perfect sense from a Humean point of view. It's much more plausible for him, it's much closer to our experience, that everything is necessitated, that for every event there is some sort of set cause or set of causes that produces it. So for human actions, there are always motivations. They may be complex, they may operate in weird ways that we don't fully understand, but they all do necessitate what it is that we do. So that, voluntary actions are voluntary in the sense that they come from us and our faculty of will is involved, but our faculty of will doesn't waver between them and engage in some sort of deliberative judgment and then use its power to choose one over the other. Instead, we just act the way that we do. So let's start with what he has to say. He tells us that this is a objection to his theory. I can foresee other objections derived from topics I've not treated of. And then he says, it may be said, for instance, that if voluntary actions be subjected to the same laws of necessity with the operations of matter, then there's a continued chain of necessary causes preordained and predetermined, reaching from the original cause of all to every single volition of the human creature. No contingency anywhere in the universe, no indifference, no liberty. While we act, we are at the same time acted upon. So the idea there would be whatever illusion we have of freely choosing things, that's not what's really going on. As a matter of fact, we're behaving the way that we are in the present because of this entire long chain of causality that goes all the way back to God. And there's a couple interesting implications if that's the case. If we've got this chain of causes going all the way back to the omnipotent, omniscient, all-good creator, he says, the ultimate author of all our volitions is the creator of the world who first bestowed motion on this immense machine and placed all beings in that particular position, whence every subsequent event by an inevitable necessity must result. So what are the results of this? Well, we're posed with an interesting dilemma, which goes against our ordinary ways of thinking about things. Human actions would not be bad. There would be, as Hume is saying, no turpitude in them. Turpitude is coming from the Latin turpe, which means badness, right? There wouldn't be any genuine evil caused by human beings. They have no moral turpitude. Why? Because they proceeded from such a good cause. God is good, so therefore whatever God created is good, even if it means my screwed up motives and emotions and psychological dynamics that lead me to be a jerk to people. Well, that's fine because God made me that way. And people do, in fact, make those sort of excuses. This is just the way I am, right? And then we often say to them, no, it's not. You have a choice. Or if that's really the way you are and you're not happy with it, change yourself. So we don't completely accept this. But we would have to accept that if we really believed that God is the cause of all of our volitions and actions. Or there's another possibility. God himself, itself, whatever God is involved in that very turpitude or badness. Right? He says they must involve our Creator in the same guilt while he's acknowledged to be their ultimate cause and author. And here Hume has an example of something that is a little harder to relate to. He says, a man who fired a mine is answerable for all the consequences, whether the train he employed be long or short. So a mine is an explosive charge that you set off, and whether you have a long cord or whether you're doing it with, a blasting machine or something like that, you're the one who actually triggered it. So whether it's years and years of history or God reaching into my head and, monkeying around with stuff in there right now, it doesn't matter. God made me do what I'm doing in some way. God is the cause of this. So if there really is badness in it, then God's a bad God. God's a bad whatever. God can be judged on that basis. And Hume says, well, both of these are things we don't want to really buy into. How can we address this? So before that, though, I do want to say one other thing that he points out here. He says, our clear and unalterable ideas of morality establish this rule upon unquestionable reasons. When we examine the consequences of any human action, these reasons must have still greater force when applied to the volitions and intentions of a being infinitely wise or powerful. With human beings, we can say human beings are screw-ups, so therefore when human beings make another human being do things, it's entirely understandable that the screwed-up human being making the other screwed-up human being do things produces bad results. But God isn't screwed up. He says, ignorance or impotence may be pleaded for a human, but those imperfections have no place in our Creator. He foresaw, he ordained, he intended all those actions of men which we so rashly pronounce criminal. So we have to conclude either they're not criminal or that the deity, not man, is accountable for them. And then he says, we can't accept either of these. Why? These are both absurd and impious. So it follows the doctrine from which they're deduced cannot possibly be true as being liable to the same objections. So what's he rejecting here? He's actually rejecting this chain of causality going all the way back to God because he's going to reject that there's any God for the chain of causality to go back to. So he's using some of the basic suppositions of religious believers against them. And he answers the first objection that, human actions aren't bad. And he does so in kind of an interesting way. He talks first about, this is a classical distinction between what we call physical or natural evil and moral evil. Physical evil is an earthquake happens, your house falls down, something hits you on the head, crushes your skull. That's bad, right? Or a tsunami comes, washes you away, destroys thousands of human lives and all this stuff that they've made that they're dependent on. That sucks, but it's nature doing it. It's not some person pushing a button and killing a whole bunch of people. That would be moral evil. right? And sometimes physical and moral evil can kind of cooperate together. You know, you build a whole bunch of houses on a floodplain, and then the flood comes by, and everyone's like, I never thought the river would ever go beyond its boundaries, even though it's like flooded 5 times in the last 10 years. Physical and moral evil have cooperated in that case, right? But he says, with physical evil, we could say, okay, so God sets up the universe, and it works certain ways, and bad things happen, but they're not really bad because it's all part of one big scheme in which it all works out for the best. And he talks about different people holding those sorts of views, not just Christians, but also Stoics. And then he says, and here's why it's not really answering that objection, he says, that's not much consolation to somebody who's got gout. Gout is a very painful disease that you get in your legs, and it has to do with, diet in large part. He talks about the malignant humors being involved. We would say, the other physical processes. Your legs hurt you, and you can't walk around very easy because you're gouty because of all of these other causes that are taking place. Tell somebody who's got gout that it's all part of the general scheme of the universe, and they'll be like, yeah, that's not really much of a consolation to me. It's interesting philosophy or theology, but that doesn't really work for me, right? And then he talks about moral evil, right? And he says that the case is the same with moral as with physical evil. It cannot reasonably be supposed that those remote considerations which are found of so little efficacy with regard to the one will have more profound influence with regard to the other. It says that the way our minds are formed is when somebody does something to us that we don't like, we're not like, oh, well, chain of causality going all the way back to God. That person couldn't have helped doing what they do. It's just the way the universe is formed. No, we're like, that SOB, I want to punch him in the nose. We get upset about it, and we want other people to be upset about it too, right? So this first objection that, human actions aren't ever bad because they trace back to God, Hume is supporting it and then taking that support away. The second objection is even more interesting, right? Saying that God would be involved in that badness. He says, well, this maybe could be answered, but he says, it admits not of so easy and satisfactory an answer, nor is it possible to explain distinctly how the deity can be the immediate cause of all actions of men without being the author of sin and moral turpitude. And then here he sort of punts it to theology. He says, these are mysteries which mere natural and unassisted reason, the philosopher's work, right, is very unfit to handle. Whatever system she embraces, she must find herself involved in inextricable difficulties and even contradictions, right, to reconcile the indifference and contingency of human actions with prescience or to defend absolute decrees and yet free the deity from being the author of sin has been found hitherto to exceed the power of philosophy. So, he's saying this, maybe there is a solution to this, but it's not one for philosophers. Theologians step in and handle this. Now, is Hume being a fideist here and saying, this is where reason comes to an end and we must listen to the voice of revelation? No, not really. He doesn't really buy that because you can, read his dialogues concerning natural religion or his natural history of religion and come away with the impression, quite rightly, that he doesn't buy any of this theistic stuff at all. So kicking the ball downfield to theology is just sort of like letting it go off of a cliff. And so he hasn't really satisfactorily addressed either of these objections. Hume does think that there is a doctrine of necessity, right? And so he's committed to that. So the implication then is, well, let's take God out of the picture. So he's doing something quite clever here that you have to kind of look behind the scenes to figure out exactly what's going on. And that is his treatment of this issue of God and evil and necessity.